Hello, good morning. Good morning for some, good night for other people, and good afternoon for other part of the world. So we are live again. So it's 7:15 p.m. in Ireland, and it's working day for the SSI volunteers. And as usual, we do have uh, a special guest, but today we do have a, a double gift for everybody. We do have Karin and Tanya. Both are workers from the SSCI. Karin is German and she gave a speech last week, and Tanya is Irish. And both we will talk to you today. So we won't see me. I will be in the background, but I will leave these two lovely ladies discuss about the spiritism, and Tanya will give you some background to what they're gonna talk about. Okay, so let me bring these two girls up. So hi Karen, hi Tanya, good to
Pleasure.
see
Hi,
you.
Hey,
everyone.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you, by the way, for be with us today. Okay,
It's a great
and
pleasure.
so before we start, Tanya, can you do the initial prayer and then you introduce a little bit about the topic today?
sure.
Okay, thank you, guys. I'll be in the background today. No Brazilian talking, no Brazilian English.
So, lifting our hearts and minds up to our friends in spirit, lifting our hearts and minds to God and asking for their love, their protection, to inspire a useful and insightful conversation where we learn together from each other about the richness of different cultures, what unites us, and what can be different within our cultures that can enrich our human experience. Help us to focus on the ways and means that we can translate the essence of these teachings into a culturally sensitive and effective way that can help alleviate people's doubts, at times sufferings, but also to lift their spirits and accelerate their progress on the evolutionary journey of life. And so the conversation this evening, and it is a conversation, uh, was triggered by a conversation with Stephen that has been ongoing for a few months around Spiritism from different cultural perspectives, about translating Spiritism into European culture effectively. And specifically, we were talking about English speaking culture and the Irish setting that we're in, that the SSI is in. And it's triggered quite a rich conversation that's been evolving, and it will continue to evolve. And the suggestion was that Karen and I to kickstart this conversation that hopefully will continue amongst whoever's taking part. And please feel free to ask questions that we can address towards the end. And it's in the context of seeing that Spiritism, as most will know, started in France with the work of Allan Kardec and many, many others, then spread throughout Europe and spread throughout the world. And unfortunately, with the advent of World War I and then World War II, Spiritism effectively died out in Europe to a large extent. Certainly the progress that had been made was lost as other priorities took over. And happily, the teachings in the late 19th century, these ideas of a new way of looking at humanity, looking at life, took root in South America, particularly in Brazil, where they flourished and very much adapted to the local culture. I think about 2 billion people in Brazil would call themselves Spiritists, probably more. And since the late 90s, or even early 90s, there has been a movement back towards Europe as Brazilians have traveled back to Europe and brought these ideas, this thinking, and the body of knowledge with them. And that has provided the opportunity for Europeans to reconnect to these ideas and to learn from them. And that presents opportunities, and it also presents opportunities to adapt the perspective to the European setting, to the European culture. Because I think when these teachings went to Brazil, they really took root in the existing culture and adapted to the local way of thinking, which really, I think, connected a lot to the more spiritual, religious elements. And in a European context, when that came back, that perhaps there's an opportunity to turn the volume up more on the philosophical elements and on the scientific elements to help to allow it to become more accessible to Europeans. A number of Europeans, I think, can have a mental block around religion, organized religion, and will connect more with spirituality. Many won't, and certainly in Ireland, there is still a strong opening, and I've felt it because I've been out of Ireland for many years, came back a year ago. I lived in the UK for over 20, a more a culture that has effectively shifted in terms of, despite sort of people claiming to be Christian, are not claiming to be Christian, but identifying, I should say, as Christian, the practice in terms of daily rituals or weekly rituals has fallen away for many. And people can tend towards atheism or agnosticism. So different, even within the English-speaking world, there's different cultures, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So approaching these ideas from a philosophical angle, from a scientific angle, of which there's many rich ideas within Spiritism, I think can really help to translate the ideas into the local cultures, and also translating it into the 21st century. So a quick parallel that came to mind when I thought about this is how important it was to appreciate that Brazil kept these ideas alive and strong until they were ready to come back to Europe. It reminded me a bit of Ireland, where with the collapse of the Roman Empire, Christianity retreated with the Dark Ages to the edges of Europe, and particularly to Ireland, which at the time was known as the island of saints and scholars, because Christianity really flourished. Being at the geographical extreme helped to preserve it, relatively speaking. And then when the time was right, it flowed back like a tide going out and a tide coming back. And in some respects, the Brazilian experience struck me as similar, that starting in Europe, going to South America, to Brazil particularly, and then flowing back into Europe. So that was, I thought, a parallel perhaps that we could look at. So it's very much to appreciate and in gratitude to those who worked hard to make that, to reseed Spiritism within a European context, to learn English, to learn a new language, to set up groups, to establish groups up and down different countries to make this available. So it's to build on that work around how to think now, where does this go now, to open these ideas to more people from the variety of backgrounds that we have within different European cultures. So Ireland is much more heterogeneous now than it was. For example, Dublin, there's at least 20% of the population is international. And when I left Ireland, that definitely wasn't the case. So it's making it accessible to all, effectively. So just one last point, I think, was that I did, and Karen as well, did a little bit of research on how Kardec expressed these ideas. And when I looked it up on Kardecpedia, it was interesting to note that he much more frequently he spoke about Spiritism as being a new philosophy, a new science, and even gave a talk that Charles Kemp, Karen pointed out to me that Charles Kemp gave a talk a few weeks ago where he references a talk that Kardec gave where he basically says that Spiritism is not a religion, but he qualifies it. He says it's not a religion in the commonly understood sense of the word, that it doesn't have priests, it doesn't have hierarchy, it doesn't have rituals or worship or dogma, but where effectively instead it is more an exploration of humanitarian and spiritual ideals, and learning about the development of kindness towards everyone, in that sense, that it is a more universal body of knowledge. So I think he was trying to move it into a perspective that was enlarging it beyond something sectarian, which he suffered in his life, having grown up in a Catholic setting and then moving to a Protestant setting. He saw that kind of, he was trying to break free of those boxes into something that was more universal. And so I think likewise in a European context, important for us to adapt these ideas to make the language and the ideas more universal in the way that we speak about them to those outside the Portuguese-speaking population. Karen, I don't know if you want to add further to that.
Yeah, basically fully agree with what you explained, and I especially liked the parallel that you made between our friends, brothers and sisters in Brazil, having kept Spiritism alive and developed it a lot, and the parallel of how Ireland kept Christianity alive. So it's really, really beautiful. And we, yeah, as you mentioned, we have talked a bit before about the topic and exchanged a lot. And the fact that we looked a bit into what did Kardec say about the religious aspect. Does he refer to religion or not? It does no means mean that we would not acknowledge that some spiritists just see Spiritism as their religion. It's absolutely fine. Especially if you concentrate on the gospel, even on the title, say the gospel according to Spiritism, with explanation of the moral maxims of Christ in concordance with Spiritism and their applications to the different circumstances of life. So focusing on the moral maxims of Christ, and of course in the gospel we see a lot of reference to Spiritists being Christians, because who's a Christian? It's not Christianity itself is not a religion, but these are followers of Christ's maxims, as the title states. And if we would like to consider that for ourselves as a religion or not, everyone decides, of course. But as you said here, in Europe, religion is very much associated with dogmas, hierarchy, ceremonies, and this is it's clearly not. And if we want to take all doubts out of the world, we also found this in the book What is Spiritism? Allan Kardec summarizes it at the end of the prologue, where he says, Spiritism is simultaneously a science of observation and a philosophical doctrine. As a practical science, it consists in the relations that can be established with spirits. As a philosophy, it entails all the moral consequences that result from such relations. Hence, it may be defined as follows. Spiritism is a science that deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, and their relation with the corporeal world. I think of basing on this explanation, we can find ways how to make the Spiritist teachings accessible again to people here in Europe. So what's basically the idea of the conversation. What leave it with you, Tanya?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's about thinking about where other people are coming from, and how to translate these ideas in the sense of using language and references that are familiar to them and that are open and accessible to them. And I think for many Europeans, when we've had a discussion about this over the last few days, is that for some, and I know I've had this experience where I brought somebody to a Spiritist meeting and they reacted against the language that was being used and the way the ideas were being presented, because they felt that it was being done in a very religious way, where the talk focused a lot on good and evil, and that language, using that language, pressed their buttons, to be frank. And I thought it was a shame, because when afterwards I then asked, and this is somebody who is spiritually open, has since gone on to do Reiki courses, does healing, would be, I think, and when we speak about the ideals in a more general way, we have a very, very good discussion. But I think certain types of language that in English-speaking culture brought it back to an old past that could be not the happiest of pasts, that we don't know what the unconscious of particular spirits may be with, because there can be associations in the past with conflict, with war, over religion. And so there is a sensitivity there. And so using more universal language. So, for example, instead of good and evil, saying right and wrong, for example, which is a more philosophical way of saying it, for example, opens up the conversation. It means you don't lose somebody at the beginning. You keep the language open and accessible, I think. I was also saying another example of this, of a friend of mine who's in London, who works as a carer, who has been a Spiritist for many years and probably comes closer than most people I know to really living the ideas that she's studying on a regular basis. And she goes into the homes of those that she's caring for, who are elderly or sick or infirm or whatever. And in her own words, she's speaking Spiritism all the time, but she's never using, she is using language that's universal. So she's talking about love, she's talking about kindness, patience, she's talking about universal qualities, which means she's going into the homes of people who are nearing the end of life, but she's able to have discussions that are amazing because she's respecting where they're coming from. She's using their references, their language, and using these universal qualities as a way of engaging with them. And she lifts their spirits. I have no doubt that she's doing incredible good by adapting to their reality and bringing the same ideas, but just adapting to something that's more universal. It's a bit like, a universal plug that can travel around the world, as opposed to one that's a British standard, British Irish standard, because we've inherited, or the French or the German or the whatever, or the US or the South American, but that's a universal adapter. And I think there are certain words that can be used that are more accessible and that are more likely to then allow people to move in, to explore these ideas without losing them at the beginning because of language that may have a charge unconsciously or consciously. So yeah, that's just something I've sort of thought about a bit over the last week as we prepared for this. And so I think another thing that crossed my mind was that again, sort of the evolution of these ideas and looking at sort of personal development, spiritual development, to moving away from a concept of that we what we don't have to what we are developing. So focusing on the goal of becoming a better person, focusing on solutions, so that we gradually begin to develop the good qualities that I think most would aspire to, rather than beating ourselves up for what we don't have. And I think that would be potentially a successful strategy to explore within a European context, like almost like we were talking earlier today, a coaching approach, rather than a black and white approach about right and wrong. And instead, it's about seeing, benchmarking where we're at, and then looking to develop gradually towards the qualities of patience, kindness, generosity, spirit, gentleness, ultimately all the qualities of love, selflessness. And so a forward-focused, positive approach, I think, could be beneficial, and taking a leaf from the book of coaching around developing these qualities. I'd looked at some of the research of Skinner, who was a behavioral psychologist in a previous job, actually a few years ago, and it was so interesting because he did research on changing behavior in animals, which was a proxy for human beings. And what he found was that punishment, which often can be used, even in the Gospel according to Spiritism at times, is used as a language that I wonder in the 21st century if such language would be used, but that punishment was not a way of affecting positive behavior change, because what it did was it stopped certain behaviors, but it didn't, as soon as the punishment was removed, the old behavior returned, and it didn't lead to the development of the positive or the desired behavior, whereas rewarding the positive behaviors would effectively lead to the desired behavior change. Why do I bring that up? I think it's again going back to that that idea of how we develop the good qualities, and that we take that goal-focused approach, and that rather than beating ourselves up at times for not being as selfless as we'd like, not being as patient as we'd like, to notice it and to be perhaps a bit kinder and more supportive and encouraging, to try a bit harder and to learn from the experience and focus forward, and then to appreciate progress that's made, and doing that for each other so that we bring ourselves and each other along. It's just a thought that kind of, because if you look at themes, I think, that are happening at the moment, positive psychology is on the rise. Coaching is something that's exploded in the US and now as much in Europe as well. And so these more upside focused approaches, I think, are obviously resonating within the culture. And so I would look to learn from this and adapt to the ways and means that could work for locals. And so, yeah, effectively, that Benjamin Franklin came to mind, where he outlined 13 different virtues, as he called them, qualities, however you want to phrase it, where he would coach himself. Each week he would pick one to see how he had developed patience, temperance, etc. And so he sort of used that as a tool throughout his life. So Karen and I then looked at translations, and there's a great passage in the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 23, item 3, where it speaks about the importance of appropriate translations, where they say it's important for us to pay attention to the customs and characters of various peoples, which can have a great influence on their language, because without understanding their culture, the true meaning of words may be lost. And the same term can pass from one language to another, but get lost in translation. In one, it could be an insult and a blasphemy, while in another, it has absolutely no impact. And even in the same language, some words may lose their value over time. So for this reason, a rigorously literal translation does not always express the thought exactly. So important to use equivalents or to paraphrase instead. And then they go on to say, this is particularly relevant to interpretations of the gospel, where taking the environment that Jesus lived in into account is important to understand what he meant. And the example being the camel passing through the eye of the needle, the rich man getting into heaven. And the word for camel and the word for rope were the same in ancient Hebrew. So it was a mistranslation, that a true translation would have been to pass a rope through the eye of a needle, which, while still impossible, is a lot easier to imagine than putting a camel through the eye of a needle. And so some words that I think that are very used in French and in Portuguese, where they're both Romance languages, don't necessarily translate well into English. So one is doctrine. The word doctrine in English can be quite activating, or to indoctrinate. And instead, I would suggest teachings or body of principles or ideas. Because, for example, indoctrinate in English means, or is understood now, I think, as being to force your ideas on somebody. And so that could be quite activating for an English speaker. And so instead to use counsel, to counsel someone or to have a constructive conversation. So it's just adapting to the nuancing of the local culture. Ostensive mediumship in Portuguese is used a lot because of mediunidade ostensivo, whereas in English I would say sensitive mediumship. It's kind of a false friend, as they would say in French. We spoke about evil, I would say bad or wrongdoing instead of evil. Instead of pasi, using healing or spiritual healing. An interesting, I had a debate a few years ago with a friend about the word charity and charitable, and he had a really, really strong reaction against it. And this never crossed my mind, but he saw it as patronizing, as coming from an old religious background. And so what I've come to think is that actually kindness is a more universal way of speaking. To develop kindness, to develop generosity of spirit, is language that is more philosophical, shall we say, whereas charity could be associated with religion. And it's ironic because I work in a charity. So it is a legal word as well. But I just think a more universal word would be kind, using kind or kindness. Evangelization in English, again, is quite an activating word. It is quite a loaded word. And so I think talking about teaching the ideals of Jesus, for example. So there's other words, but I'm sorry that went on a bit long, but it was just to give examples of where I think where a literal translation can potentially, without realizing, disengage the listener, and instead to nuance it to a language that's more neutral, shall we say, in their culture. So Karen, I know you've looked at why people come to connect to Spiritism, and maybe you'd like to take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Well, there probably, if we would just ask any one of you why you connected to Spiritism, how you found out about it, I think we would get a broad range of answers. So there can be many reasons that lead people to look for a spiritual path and come across Spiritism. Well, basically, what probably many of us, or all of us, are curious about. So who am I? Trying to understand oneself. Where do I come from? Why am I here? And what happens after what we call death? Well, then people may try to just want to try and understand life in a bigger sense. So what's the reason behind all this, and what is the reason behind all the differences we see between people, and all these questions that one might ask oneself. And of course, we have people who are more looking for healing, for help because of different experiences they had, either a serious illness where they were really facing their mortality and kind of tried, or something was triggered that makes them puts them on a pathway where they want to find out more about our essence, or maybe let it be some experience, mediumship, people experience sensations. Sorry, people experiencing something that they cannot explain, but that they might be afraid to talk about. But you know, something that you feel is not considered as normal, and then you might look for someone who can help you without you going to your doctor, or opening up to someone that you might be afraid would judge you on that. So maybe many reasons, trying to overcome certain issues, relationship problems, problems at work, anger, depression. There can be many different issues, and the Spiritist teachings are so rich. They offer so much information, so many answers to all these questions, that it can really help people who are searching. And so when we exchanged earlier about it, we really thought, think we should all see the Spiritist teachings as an opportunity to help us understanding the bigger picture in life, beyond that one material existence that we are living, and beyond the material bodies and things that we can see, which will help us find ways, which is rich of knowledge, find ways to heal ourselves, to help ourselves in different challenging situations, and also to see how we can help others and what are the consequences of this. Through these studies, we understand that we are much more than this physical body, but that in our essence we are immortal beings, and this is something we should really reflect upon. Immortal, what that means. And we learn that all of us, despite the differences we see in this one existence, the social differences, we have all been created equal, and we are learning on a very long journey based on the law of action and reaction. So as Tanya once expressed it, we're sowing what we reap along the way. So, and if we start understanding this, that helps us to answer so many questions, that helps us to face the challenges on our pathway, and the trials, as we call them, the trials, because we are still on a stage of development where we need trials and expiations, but we learn to understand why we suffer, and that this suffering does not last forever, which is very important to understand, I think, and how to overcome it and how to face it. So this is something so rich, that all these people, that all these situations that we mentioned before, of people who may be looking for some spiritual pathway, there are so many answers, and we just need to find a way to bring it to more people, not in a way of trying to convert anyone, but trying to offer this useful information, this very rich philosophy that has helped us. And of course, we do have this this desire to share it with others as well. And as we changed before, through the studies, we will also find out that basically the teachings of Jesus, if considered today and if compared with what people are looking for in terms of mental well-being, in terms of improving our society, how to live a more peaceful life, how to find balance and harmony. So if we follow just the teachings of Jesus, the moral teachings, we will reach all this, and this is what most of us are looking for. Maybe as we exchanged before, Tanya, on the Irish background, I don't know if you want to add on the Catholic background in Ireland, because with this background, I think people are a bit more open to the moral teachings, or let's say the spiritual aspect, if you want to call it like that.
Yeah, I think now I'll caveat what I'm going to say with I lived outside of Ireland for many years, over 20 years, and I'm only back a year. Lived in the UK and elsewhere, and so Ireland has changed a lot in terms of Catholicism. When I left, churches were full on a Sunday, and now it's quite different. And obviously, there's been a lot of pain and suffering in Ireland, which has led to disillusionment. But what I found with friends is that their belief is still there, but they may not engage in the practice in the way that perhaps their parents would have done, or that they would have done when younger. And there may well be an openness to looking at spirituality in a broader sense. And I think it would be to see it as a complement to, and not in competition with, Catholicism, to enlarge the understanding, let's say, within Catholicism, because certainly I was brought up as a Catholic, and it helps to show, to explain elements that within Catholicism were left, or that seemed to be mysterious or inexplicable. Some of the parables, for example, or how miracles worked, which is described from a more scientific perspective, shall we say, so healing, for example, or the power of the mind and the energy that flows with it, so that there's electromagnetic currents, our minds connect, and there can be that flow of energies, and that can be for good or for ill, depending on how it's used. So it expands on and complements, I think, the core teachings within Catholicism. So in an Irish context, I think, I don't know yet, but I'm sort of thinking out loud as we're speaking, is not to present it as an alternative, but to present it as an interesting complement, and to use language that's, I guess, more about spirituality, more about sort of the scientific elements, because then it's coming at it from not just a different angle, but a different layer of understanding, the more rational, shall we say, rather than that sort of pure instinctive thing that's a desire to connect with something bigger than us, that I think many of us feel instinctively. And certainly that's how I connected with Spiritism. Just adding to that perspective, and helping to make perhaps more sense to some of the elements that would have been left as a bit of a mystery, and translating as well. We'd spoken about sort of the literal translation, but also the cultural translation as well, to think that within an English speaking context, English does tend to be more, tends to be quite concise and direct in its expression. That there are these themes that are very much present, that you mentioned, around, let's say, mental well-being, and particularly at the moment, given what's happening, that there's a pandemic that has been declared by the World Health Organization around mental health, not just the COVID, and the risk that the secularization that's happened in a lot of European countries leaves a void, an emptiness in terms of a meaning for life. And so coming up with a perspective and ideas that answer in a rational way to that, which for me, that's what Spiritism has done, that it is a rational explanation for life, for the anomalies of life that would otherwise look to be random. So, you know, the social injustices, for example, or the the apparent injustice of some being born into loving families, others being born with disabilities, others being born into very, very challenging circumstances. And so instead seeing it as part of a small part of a much longer journey through reincarnation, I think gives certainly would open it up for debate. And I think we've spoken about how strongly I think Europeans connect to Spiritism when presented in terms of its impact on health. And so I'll let you speak about that, and then I'll speak about my experience when I lived in the UK and that. But I think that's very relevant at the moment.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Oh. When we exchanged about it, we both had a similar experience or impression from what types of or what aspects of Spiritism do resonate with Europeans. When we moved, I got to or started studying Spiritism in Brazil, and afterwards we moved to Germany from there, and then slowly got to know the Spiritist movement in Germany. And the one event per year that attracted most native Germans, the one Spiritist event, was the Congress for Medicine and Spirituality that has been organized once a year. And I was wondering, because there are a few bigger events in the country happening, but not all of them attract Germans in the same way. But then if you think about well, our mentality, the Germans, we are very rational, rather than being very open to well, emotional topics, or the moral aspects or spiritual aspects, if you want to call it like that, of the Spiritist teachings, but the scientific ones and philosophical ones, which are being presented by this movement of the Association of the Medical Spiritist Associations, which intend to show the connection between spirituality and medicine, between spirituality and science, and to bring a more holistic approach to medicine, for instance, showing that we are much more than this physical body, and this has to be taken into account when we are sick, when someone is trying to heal us or help us healing, actually. And this is a topic that in Germany is very much being discussed, is very on vogue, if you want to call it like that. So many people are trying to find answers because they feel that there must be something more, and that they cannot be healed if they're only treating this material body. So this is one aspect where people really get interested. Many come to those events, and they're not necessarily Spiritists. So just people being open to this topic of spirituality, to this fact that's been shown through studies, research, on, just to give some examples, near-death experience, for instance. This is something that the fact itself is being accepted by many people, but not many could really have a rational explanation for why we are able to perceive something while our brain actually had no activities, or studies on the influence of prayer on our health, the influence of emotions on our health. So these are topics that people are really asking themselves about, because they feel there is something more. And in this field, there's the Spiritist teachings have, and the associations of Spiritist doctors, they really have a lot to offer. And this is a way to show to more people, or to bring these ideas to more people, and maybe make them curious to find out a bit more. Again, not to convert people and to make as many Spiritists as possible in the world, but to offer really useful, helpful information to people who are looking for something that can help them. Well, yeah, that's one example.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. That likewise, when I lived in London, that by far the most well attended of all the events was the Medical Spiritual Congress. So that it was the only event where the number of native English speakers outnumbered those that spoke Portuguese. because it was on a platform that was that was scientific, and that where there was incredibly strong speakers from the backgrounds of physical and mental health, from Brazil, from the US and the UK, and they included some really great research, academic research that had been done by some of these doctors to show the impact that, for example, spiritual healing had on, and various other works, including mediumship work on, let's say, schizophrenia, which is seen as a condition that could be one that's treated, but that's not reversible. And in fact, there was one study that showed 1/3 of patients were healed, which was to a Western medical audience that seemed extraordinary. That they had achieved such incredibly strong results by having a combined traditional treatment complemented by spiritual treatment as well, that they had achieved extraordinary results. There was a cardiologist who spoke about, again, a mixed treatment of sort of traditional cardiological, but also looking at the spiritual, looking at the psychological and the emotional, and the impact that that had on somebody who was well on their way to serious heart issues. So I think there's a richness in the Spiritist materials that could be very, very interesting, and how to make that more open and accessible. And we spoke earlier about there's a great academic paper done by some doctors in Brazil on the pineal gland, and this was discussed in the book Missionaries of the Light, which was published in the 40s, where there are a number of different qualities. I think there's about 8 different characteristics of the gland that are described in the book that was not even imagined in science at the time. And then decades later, that came into being. So one of them was around that it was the controller of mental life. It was the gland controlling mental life, controller of the emotions, controller of circadian rhythm, and the emission of a mental hormone. I can't remember the words exactly that they used. But that predated by about 40 years the discovery of melatonin. So basically, in the book, the doctors in the book that was channeled through Chico Xavier predicted that in the future scientists would discover this particular hormone that we now know as melatonin, that in fact is being used for at times for mental health, as well as circadian rhythm disruptions. So there is a richness of things there, and taking that angle, I think, particularly in terms of mental well-being and the learning that can come from that, could be of great benefit.
Absolutely. And then there's a lot of, I know I'm just looking a bit at the time, and I don't think we have too much time left. I don't go into details. There's a lot of more scientific information, like, for example, in other books by Andrea Louise included as well, which might be helpful in the future to bring, or to study upon here in Europe as well. And earlier we also exchanged on how to now make all this accessible. Well, one thing where we start focusing really on fields or thinking about what in our country can be interesting for local people, what can really be helpful for them. Then, of course, the question of language. If we want to bring these ideas to more people, of course, we will have to adapt to the language, which also means that at events that we organize, if we have a mixture of people from Brazil who have been bringing all these rich teachings back, and who are doing a great job organizing a lot of groups, Spiritist events. But if the intention of the event is really to invite more local people, then I think we need to be very disciplined and address them in their language, and also while someone else is in the room, keeping the discipline. I know it's a topic that has been discussed quite some times, and it doesn't mean that certain Spiritist groups might not have different days where they have studies in Portuguese and then another day in the local language. But if it is in a local language and intended to catch more people, it's important to really stick to that, because otherwise, as a local, you don't really feel at home if you go to a group where everyone else speaks another language and where you think, I'm a bit alien, or maybe Spiritism is this more Brazilian thing, which is not, and we have all these good intentions, and sometimes it's just a little discipline that lacks. So that was one thought, and I'm trying to be a bit more short now. Sorry.
Sorry, can I just add to that I hugely appreciate, having moved back from London to find the group in Dublin, and the fact that they operate exclusively in English, which is incredibly impressive. Yeah. Because some people haven't been in Ireland or an English-speaking country for as long as others. And people make a huge effort, and it is so appreciated. So I really just want to acknowledge that and thank so many people in the Spirit Society of Ireland for the great effort that they make to level the playing field and make it open and available to not just to locals, but also to others where the common language is English, whether they be from other European countries or elsewhere around the world. Because I know it requires an effort, because I lived in France, I lived a bit in Brazil. I know how much you want to speak in your own language. So I really value that and appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'll also sign that. And really my highest respect to the group. One other aspect when we exchanged about was that, of course, if someone comes to a Spiritist group for the first time, or the second or the third one, it's very interesting to listen to the talks and studies. But then people also will have probably lots of questions. So I think that it's always important when we organize something, or if you have a group, that we are available to questions, and that can be in very different forms. That either reserve some space at the end of a talk, or if you have an open study group where everyone can speak and ask, that's very helpful. Or just have someone available to the people who have questions, rather than just having a talk and then afterwards you go home. But yeah, you have the books, but maybe you want to talk to someone. So having this interactive approach, I think, is very important. And nowadays that we all actually are not able to meet in groups and organize physical or events with physical presence, I think a lot is happening online as this conversation right now. And this moment, I think, is a great chance for us to make more Spiritist content available to more people, because people are going more online at the moment because they can't leave their homes. We have great examples that for many different groups in Europe have different ways to reach out, and some like Pekka in Finland that many of us know, part of the Finnish Spiritist movement, and they produce lots of different things. So they have their website with articles, lots of information for people who are trying to find out more. Producing videos, interviews where they explain about the basic questions of Spiritism. And I think this is something that we can focus on more, making more material available in the way that people like to have it. So also meaning short videos for those who just want to get a short overviews, and then offering more material, writing about topics that are or that people are thinking about or meditating upon in general, and trying to bring us the answers that the Spiritist teachings offer us to that. But these were a few things that we thought might be helpful to reach more people. Yeah, maybe you have more ideas, Tanya.
Yeah, no, I think, having, I know over the last few weeks, I think we've all been bombarded with lots of videos and talks and stuff like that, and having, sometimes even having sort of a short intro, if it's to introduce somebody to Spiritism, having shorter videos, they're more likely, I think, to engage. And moving online opens up boundaries, because otherwise it's very geographically constrained. So people won't necessarily have coverage in terms of access to a group. And so it becomes borderless and locationless, and opens up to those that are curious. And so I guess using keywords that are, as I said earlier about this, and I know I'm kind of banging on about it, but I do firmly believe it, is using a language that's universal around, let's say, self-development, personal development, and even, I think, as well around sort of spiritual psychology, that's is more about development of oneself, not just remedial, but also proactive, and developing our full potential as a person. And so I think that broadens the pool of people that could connect with engaging with the material, because there's some amazing stuff that has been sent through the books that Shika Xavier channeled, and also the Joanna de Angelis books around spiritual psychology. I think that translated culturally would be incredibly valuable to a number of people. Amongst others, that's just to name some. It's not by no means comprehensive. And so I guess to sort of wrap up is that sense of using a cultural reference that opens the potential for making this accessible, so that people can then decide for themselves. So, as you said rightly, it's not about proselytizing, it's not about converting, it's simply about communicating, so that people are aware of what's available, and then they can decide for themselves if that's what's of interest and of value to them. But it would seem unfair not to make it at least available, so that in ways that are accessible to them, so that they can then decide for themselves. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of it from my perspective. If there's anything that you'd like to add to close, in case there's any questions.
Yeah, maybe there are questions. Sorry, I'm looking at the time. No, we can't see them from here. the questions or comments.
Hello. Wow. Such a great talk. Good conversation. And thank you very much for availability. Yeah, let me check if you have some questions here. 1 minute. Okay, I think it's a question for me, like, all spirit centers have mediumship practice. What is the SSI perspective to embrace that practice in the near future? Well, Patricia, we are working on it, but we are not worried about it, to be honest, because the spirits, the mentors of the group, will lead us to this. So we are thinking about it. We are working on it, but one day I hope it comes. So it's not necessary a spirit center working well. They need to have a mediumship medium. No. My question is: have you read all the Kardec books? Are you practicing it? So we need to do this. So yes, we will have it at the right time.
And can I compliment that, Stephen?
Sure,
which is the thought that certainly by no means all. I mean, I know in London not all centres have mediumship groups that are working in that way, but that mediumship is at work in the groups in different ways, such as through the healing mediumship, when healing is given, and often when people give a talk, they often are inspired in giving the talk, as well as the conversations that can happen after, where people are actually talking about the ideas and looking to help, particularly when there is some spiritual support around atendimento fraterno, there can be inspiration and comfort given through that. So in effect, mediumship is operating often without people realizing it, because they're not necessarily aware that they're mediums. And so it's an opportunity for people to be a positive channel for potentially to comfort or to help somebody in a way that we can't imagine.
Yeah. Thank you. And we do have another question. A question here. Here. Hi, ladies. How would you depict the spiritist scenario here on Ireland? Is it developing in a good pace?
I would say it is. As I said earlier, I've been incredibly grateful and impressed by the work that the team has done to put in place a strong foundation. There's a very good team. There's a strong team that has been built up over the years, which is particularly impressive, I think, given the high level of turnover amongst the Brazilian community in Dublin, because many come to study and then leave after a few years. So there's been a very good and strong foundation put in place. And if you look at the number of people who come on a weekly basis, there's a high level of turnout. And I think it's about building on that to expand it in terms of opening into more connections with local, I shouldn't say local, international and local people who could be open. So there's a very, very strong base, and then I think it's building from there. So I give real kudos to great praise to the team who've worked hard, who really have worked hard, so that base is there, and they've supported an awful lot of people over the years, and made a real difference to help them at times going through quite challenging times.
Yeah. Okay. We do have here 2 more questions. So this Alain, I think making the books written in Portuguese accessible to not Portuguese speakers sounds what Luther did in his revolution. Yeah. Okay. A question here from Chicago. If we don't have mediums, are we true Spiritist center or just a study group? Very good question. I can give my perspective, Don. Spiritist is not a group, is not a being medium or not. Spiritist is as long as you have the philosophy, you may have spiritism. Spiritism is not attached to mediumship. And if you want to call it spiritist group or spirit center, it's up to you. The main part for me, especially Esteban, for me, what is more important is practice the spiritism teachings inside and outside the spiritism. Once I'm doing this, I'm completely being a spiritist. And by the way, I'm too far from that goal. So, what are your thoughts, ladies?
Absolutely, that's what we learn when we study who is the true spiritist, the one who tries to the best to improve morally and apply those teachings. We all know that this is a gradual process, but I fully agree with you, and there might be different opinions on how we want to call such a group. And well, the group in Dublin, at least, and as I knew it, offers, for instance, healing sessions. So this is applied mediumship as well in a different way, of course. So there can be, I think it's a very complex discussion of how we want to call such a group. But Tanya gave a very beautiful example of groups who not have dedicated mediumship groups, but where people still act as mediums. So, yeah, it's complex, I think.
And also that I think we're mediums 24/7. It's not just for 3/4 of an hour once a week or an hour once a week, where great good things can happen, where it's a cohesive group, a well-balanced group, a harmonious group. But without a strong foundation, without good study and knowledge about the ideas, learning, committing to putting them into practice, because like you, Stephen, the hard thing for me about Spiritism is seeing what good looks like. It has gone way beyond what I used to think it was. And so I now see myself very far from that. And so it's like, that's why I'm kind of focusing on the coaching approach to help myself on that journey. But that having that study group is essential to laying a strong foundation to a successful and a safe mediumship practice. Without it, mediumship can be very challenging. And so I would prefer to take cautious probably isn't the right word, but taking a sound foundational approach to build harmony, strength, and knowledge within the group, so that you give yourself the best chance to be a useful instrument for the good spirits to use mediumship. And again, I would stress that is not just for 1 hour once a week. It's every day that somebody can be used as a medium if they get onto a good wavelength and manage to make that connection.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, because we need to be careful, because especially for those spirit centers who are outside of Brazil, a lot of people arrive in this new country or new place and say, "Hey, I'm being spiritist for XYZ years, and I always be in the spiritist group. I want to start with the spiritist group, mediumship group." Well, we need to see how is the goal. What we need to learn, what we need to see around these. Card. If you start to read the Spiritist magazine from Kardec, the invocation of a spirit, the mediumistic meetings were so easy. They do this so naturally that unfortunately we don't see it. But they had one thing we don't have: the stud, the foundation. And the question I want to give to launch here is: do we have the good foundation? Okay. So let's say Don gave some thanks. I've been told before we would need mediums. SI Chicago has mediums. We at SI of Illinois do not. We are all beginners here at SSI Illinois. Don, we are medium. By nature, everybody's medium. Just read Kardec. Kardec saying you're medium. So to have a spirit center, we just need to have people with good intention and love, and willing to seek one goal. That's what we need. That's what. And I'm pretty sure either in Illinois or in Chicago, you do have it.
Can I add to that, Stephen?
Yeah,
just
sure.
a thought that comes to mind. I think it's in the Medium's book that Kardec asks and answers a question where it's around what if somebody isn't a medium or a group doesn't have a medium? How are they to go about it? And he basically says that's not an issue, that it's about studying that the materials that are available and working with them, and that they will then be helped by good spirits to develop themselves individually and collectively as a group. And so there isn't a necessity to have a medium within the group, which therefore would imply there isn't a necessity to have a mediumship group working within the group. But what they want is for us to improve ourselves. And so it's that study which is the core of any group. More than the mediumship is a means to an end, whereas the end is the study. That's the real goal, I think, of a Spiritist Centre, is to promote that study, to study together so that we learn how to improve ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. And by the way, we are here to learn, and uh, Jesus didn't have a religion. He was not Catholic. He was not Spiritist. He was not Buddhist. His religion was love. And once you start to practice the Spiritism teachings, you will see that Spiritism, it's not a religion. It's not a religion, because Spiritism teaches love everyone, and love is not a religion.
And that's
Okay,
also
go.
what the Spirit of Truth says, right, in the Gospel, chapter 6. He doesn't say, my dear Spiritist, please hurry to become a medium. But he says, Spiritists, love one another. This is the first teaching.
Yeah.
Educate yourselves. This is the second. So not saying it wouldn't be important. It's of
No. We are not. Yeah, yeah. We are.
not, even if you go to that chapter, it's not the
Yeah.
the most important issue, I would say.
Yeah, and for sure, of course, there are a lot of spirit centers with people who are practicing these, are very well connected. What Tanya said, and yes, if your spirit center wants to start a mediumship group, and go ahead, happy days, no problem. It's that is not right or wrong, you know. Okay, ladies, thank you so much for your time. So we passed 10 minutes of over our time. Thank you for the discussion, and it's good to see how everybody is interacting. So once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution. And Karen, can you do a final prayer for us? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So maybe once again lift our hearts up and our thoughts, and thank God for these moments that we could spend together, trying to reflect a bit more on how to offer these teachings that have helped us so much to others as well, make them available to more people, so they might help more people. May this discussion continue on many occasions with many other friends. And maybe at this moment also ask God for His support, His help for all of us who are here at this moment here on Earth, facing the challenge of this pandemic that we're going through. May all those who are desperate, those who are struggling, find the support needed. May hope fill our hearts. May we always trust that difficult times will not last forever, but that we will find a better situation soon, and that we may contribute to that. And may we also have many opportunities meet again and stay connected in our hearts, feeling that we are not alone. So great.
Thank you, ladies.
Very
Thank you
much.
very much, Karin. Thank you, Tanya, for your time.
Thank you, Stephen.
It was a really pleasure to have you here. And once again, I hope to see you both again here in other lives and in person soon.
Hopefully.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Ciao.
Ciao.